Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, he's been to Iraq half a dozen times, covering not only the strategies behind our invasion of that country, but also the struggles of those living in a war zone. A conversation with reporter George Packer next on Dialogue. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to those of you listening on public radio and the World Wide Web. He's been called the Zelig of the Iraq War. Like the fictional Woody Allen character, reporter George Packer seemed to be everywhere in Iraq, covering both the decision makers and those carrying out the mission, including Iraqis working for us. Now a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, Packer had never been to Iraq before 2003. He went in part because he could. There was a period after the war began when things were relatively calm. But he continued to go back a total of 6 times, even when the situation got worse. He's distinguished himself for bringing to light the people involved in the war, both on the American and the Iraqi sides. Many of those stories are in his book, The Assassin's Gate, which was named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times and won an Overseas Press Club Book Award. I sat down with Mr. Packer at the Sun Valley Writers Conference to talk about his work. Since 1995, the conference has brought together some of this country's leading writers and thinkers for thoughtful conversations on literature and life. I asked Mr. Packer what drew him back to Iraq again and again. First of all, welcome to Idaho.
Thank you.
You've not been here before?
I haven't, no. It's great to be here.
Well, welcome. From one eye to another eye, from Idaho to Iraq here, you've said you're an Iraq junkie, and that Iraq's gotten to you in a way that nothing since you were a Peace Corps volunteer ever has. Why is that?
I think because I first went there at the very beginning of the war and have watched the country descend into this hell over very slowly and then more quickly over the last few years, and then begin to emerge from it, and just to live it month by month, to have friends, to become connected to Iraqis, to grow very fond of some Iraqis, and then to see this, and of some Americans over there who are soldiers and civilians, and then to see it all just consume people in this horrible way. I've never seen anything like that before. I've never sort of experienced, even with that degree of, of distance, a war that grew so terrible. It's an unforgettable, and it's a sort of experience that makes you hesitate to commit yourself to anything, because I went into this war with a very ambivalent support for it, which was not public. It was my own feeling, and have felt somehow personally involved and somewhat responsible for that reason, and had high hopes. I mean, a lot of people did. A lot of Iraqis did. A lot of Americans did. To see those hopes disintegrate is pretty shattering. So, yeah, this is on a scale that I haven't experienced in my life. It's historic and big, and it'll certainly be with me forever.
Why were you, as you say, ambivalently for the war? You've called yourself an ambivalent liberal for the war. You've gotten some flack for that. There's been some hand-wringing over your position. Was it that Saddam Hussein was so cruel to his people that you held out the hope that it was a human rights nightmare that could be solved?
I couldn't imagine anything worse following Saddam Hussein. And when anti-war activists would say to me, we don't know what's going to come after this and it could be worse, I actually thought they were naive, because I thought they didn't understand the nature of a regime like that. They're too sheltered. They're Americans. And in some ways, both pro and anti-war Americans both suffer from being somewhat insulated from the world and from history. It seemed too easy an opinion. And yeah, I thought we owed it to Iraq because of the ugly entanglement we've had with that country since '91. We left things unfinished in '91. We've strangled it with sanctions. We have pursued a policy of containment that has worked okay but seemed to be falling apart. And in the end, it seemed untenable to continue that way. I certainly wouldn't have organized it and planned it and conducted on the world stage as this administration did, but as I wrote in The Assassin's Gate, you don't get your choice of war. It's handed to you, and you have to make up your mind. And really, it was almost on the night of March 19th, 2003, I just asked myself, how do I feel about this? And I knew that I wanted it to succeed.
And is that why you went? I mean, it's not like you had this, huge Rolodex of contacts in Iraq.
That's right.
It was a dangerous thing to do. Why did you decide to go in the first place?
Well, first of all, I didn't know how dangerous it was. When I went, it was the summer of 2003, and most of us thought the war was over, and this was the reconstruction phase. One soldier said to me, "So you're sort of writing the aftermath, right?" I said, "Yeah, sort of the aftermath." Well, it wasn't the aftermath. It was only the beginning, but it took a while for people to realize what was in store. I think maybe the biggest turning point was when terrorists blew up the United Nations building.
And an Idahoan died in that attack.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I was on my way out of the country that day. I knew some of the people who died in that explosion, and that told me this is a serious insurgency, and we're not ready for it. And that's after that first trip, I knew how unprepared we were. I came back with a kind of a sick feeling that this was going to overwhelm whatever the administration had imagined.
And how often have you been back? How many times?
6 times.
When was the last time you were there?
The last time was early '07. I went back to do a piece about the Iraqis who were working with the U.S. government as interpreters and other jobs.
Phenomenal piece. I have to say it's called Betrayed.
Betrayed, yeah.
I remember where I was when I was reading it. I was on an airplane, and I had this distinct feeling, or maybe I did do it, to tug on the shirt sleeve of the person next to me and say, "Look at this, read this." It's an article about the Iraqi translators and interpreters who essentially, in some instances, were left in great peril by our country.
That's right, and the minimal requests they made of our officials for protection were usually brushed aside with just a kind of bureaucratic indifference. And it was, to me, one of the great moral scandals of the war. And a friend actually said to me, this is up there with Abu Ghraib. And I think it is. It's quieter. It's not as graphic. It's not as disturbing. But when you think about what we owed these people and how much they risked to help us as well as to help themselves, and how little they asked and how little we gave, it sort of showed to me, a kind of rottenness that had set into the whole occupation. And it had to do with the green zone and the way in which our officials were cut off from the rest of the country. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was reporting that piece, I went into the embassy to interview the number 2 at the embassy about this situation, and I had some questions about why didn't you give these people higher security clearances so they could be searched inside the gates rather than outside, and all sorts of things like that. But by the time I got to his office, I had passed through maybe 3 or 4 security doors, sort of like the beginning of Get Smart, where the doors open and shut, and several searches and ID checks. And by the time I was there, it was as if not a single molecule of Baghdad was still in the air. We were in a sealed-off, hermetic environment. There was no natural light, and there were no Iraqis, because this was the classified section of the embassy. And this was the security that they felt was necessary to do their work, but it was also the security that meant they had no idea what was happening right outside the gates of the green zone. I knew far more than they did, and they had spent, in some cases, more time in Iraq than I had. So that was part of the rottenness, the corruption of the occupation. It was the fact that we cut ourselves off from Iraqis, and so we stopped knowing and caring what was happening to them.